This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to the 121st episode of Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. All you need to know about me is in that sentence. The aim of the podcast, as the title suggests, is I'm here to talk of the stories of film. And I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, release stories, marketing stories, financing stories. Just the little bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to pick for the podcast, they have a bit more of a mainstream leaning than most. I tend to pick films I'm interested in to some degree. I don't pick things I don't like as a rule. I don't do snark. I'm not very good at snark. I'm not being snarky about people who are snarky. I'm just not great at it, really. And also, I just love films. I love waffling about films. And with that in mind, I'm going to shut up this already going on too long intro. I'm going to play you a clip from one of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode, and I'm going to pick up its story, The Other Side of This.
Somewhere in the Mediterranean, on this naval aircraft carrier, these men have been selected to write a page in military history. They are the best the Navy and Air Force have to offer. They've been brought together to form an elite squad of fighter pilots. Their mission, one of national security and international concern. These are the fearless pilots.
Seems no matter what I do, I end up hurting someone.
The men who command them.
That then was a snippet from the trailer of 1991's Hot Shots! Directed by Jim Abrahams, written by Abrahams and Pat Proft. The cast of this one, Charlie Sheen, Carrie Elwes, Valeria Golino, Lloyd Bridges and John Cryer leading the ensemble. And after, this one goes back in part to the breaking apart of the Abrahams-Zucker comedy directorial team. And that's made up of David Zucker, Jim Abrahams and Jerry Zucker. They came together to do Kentucky Fried Movie, but sprung to fame with Airplane. Then they did The Peerless Top Secret. I love that film, but that's important to Hot Shots. And the last film they directed together as three credited directors was a bit of a change in tone for them. It was a comedy. It was 1986's Ruthless People, Bette Midler in that one. But importantly, Ruthless People was the first time really that they truly disagreed on how to make a film. And so with this disagreement bubbling up, the filmmakers amicably decided to go their separate ways as directors. Now, it's worth pointing out, no huge falling out. They worked on each other's projects. So as we're going to hear, David Zucker went on to do Naked Gun, for instance, and the two Zuckers and Pat Proft were involved in that as well. But the first of the three to go and direct a film on his own was Jim Abrahams, and he reunited with Bette Midler and also Lily Tomlin for 1988's Big Business. Now, Big Business was not a massive success. It was a reasonable success. It wasn't massively critically acclaimed, but it did decent enough business. But Abrams would admit that that was him exploring a little and trying to find a foothold in the film business, and he admitted he was, quote, terrified, unquote, at directing by himself for the first time, that he would look around when decisions were coming in needed to be made. He would look around to see if Jerry or David Zucker was around, and then he realised this one was on him. And he would direct a couple of films. It wouldn't be until Hot Shots came around that he said it was the one where he first felt he'd really got the hang of directing by himself. But as Abrams went off in one direction, the two Zucker brothers also made their solo directorial debuts. So David Zucker, as I've covered in a previous Film Stories podcast, directed the first Naked Gun movie, which again the Zaz team collaborated on, but it was Zucker as sole director. Jerry Zucker, meanwhile, well, he took on a small movie by the name of Ghost, and it was a small movie when he took it on, and it turned into a phenomenon and an Oscar winner at that for Whoopi Goldberg's superb performance in that film. So the two Zuckers had big hits, and then Abrams went off to direct a smaller drama, 1990s Welcome Home Roxy Carmichael, headlined by Winona Ryder. I mean, it barely got a release here in the UK. Wasn't massively well received, barely did any business in the US. And so Zucker had got big hits and Abrams hadn't. However, a plan was forming in the mind of writer Pat Proft, who had collaborated with the Zaz team for many, many years. He'd also written the first Police Academy movie, and he was toying with another parody movie. I should say from the outset, I love the spoofs and parodies, particularly, well, the early ones of the Zaz team. I think Naked Gun, Top Secret Airplane are terrific, and Hot Shots was going to be very much in that vein. But as Pat Proft said in an interview with Court Focal in France, this was not a Zaz film. This was written by Pat Proft. It was directed by Jim Abrams. This one didn't involve the Zucker brothers, even though they saw it and chatted about it, etc., etc. So the idea came to Proft when he saw the film Top Gun, and he thought Top Gun was ripe for a spoof. He talking to Trainwreck Society in an interview, he said that movie was perfect to spoof. Jets, pilots, love triangle, Saddam Hussein, ships, every joke we ever had watching any of the war films. And he talked about how he loved the Hot Shots movies and loved being able to put all these ingredients together. So he came up with the idea and got a script together, and Jim Abrams was interested. But it's worth noting that the script for this one was really, really important. That when Abrams had made Top Secret, which I will come to in a future podcast, they, in hindsight, have been fairly open about the fact that there's no story really to the film. It strings together a lot of jokes, but there's no 3-act narrative to carry you along. In the case of Hot Shots, there is, and they worked really, really hard at that. And as they would say, it's like we spent a lot of time putting together the 3 acts and the character arcs. This is Jim Abrams interviewed in Robert Emery's book, The Director's Take One. And he says he described the writing of the jokes as, quote, the frosting and the easiest part. We spent 90% of the time just working on the structure and the story of the characters. And that's not necessarily something, with no disrespect intended, you might think of a film like Hot Shots, but it was important to them to have that structure in place first before they put the jokes on top. Once they got a screenplay together, well, they had a studio interested as well. 20th Century Fox was interested in the project, and this was headed up at the time by a filmmaker, as it happened, Joe Roth, who would go over to Disney. But Joe Roth, unusually for a studio head even then, was a film director. Most of the time, it's more of a businessy person. That's no disrespect to Roth, but this was someone from a filmmaking background who was chairman of the studio, and he gave Hot Shots the green light. But notably, when it came to cast the film, well, one of the jobs he'd done just before he took over the chairpersonship of Fox was co-producing the first Major League film, and Major League had seen Charlie Sheen cast in a comedy and be impressive in a comedy, and it was Roth, therefore, who suggested the idea of Charlie Sheen as the lead of Hot Shots to Jim Abrams. So a meeting was arranged between the pair, and while Sheen was open to the idea of doing another comedy, as Abrams recalled in a further interview with Robert Emery, quote, I think Charlie was a little apprehensive because Hot Shots was further out than Major League. Well, that much is true. He took some persuading to take the role on. As it would happen, he would be glad he did take the role on. He realised he'd made the right choice, and this is zooming a little further in the story, when he was shown a videotape of the first teaser trailer, and he thought, yeah, this is going to work. I'm glad I'm in this. But conversely, there was also a commercial pressure behind the decision of Sheen to take on the role. So he talked to Empire in an interview back in its January 1992 issue. He was interviewed by Mark Salisbury, who I quote regularly on this podcast, did some terrific interviews and set reports. And he told Salisbury that he was open about the fact that his previous 3 films, at this stage, The Rookie, Men at Work, co-starring his brother Emilio Estevez, I think Estevez directed that one as well, and particularly the film Navy SEALs, had failed. Things were expected of Navy SEALs. I remember there's a video game of it. There was some anticipation for it. But in that interview, Sheen was surprisingly candid about director Louis Teague. Louis Teague directed Cat's Eye, which I think is terrific, and Jewel of the Nile. But Sheen was really open and just said we had to pull a coup and take over the picture ourselves. And as such, off the back of some films that hadn't done well at the box office, Sheen admitted that the commercial potential of Hot Shots was, quote, one of the reasons he took the film on. With Sheen taking the lead of Topper Harley in the film, then it was on to casting the role of Admiral Tug Benson. Now, this on paper looked perfect for Leslie Nielsen. Leslie Nielsen at this stage, the absolute king of spoof movies, and he was, as I understand it, sounded out about taking the role of Benson on. But he said to Abrahams, as the story goes, that he's already done spoof roles with them, and perhaps that they should look elsewhere. Also, Nielsen was making the second Naked Gun film as well, and I'll come to that a little bit further down this story. And so, with his reluctance to take on another spoof role, the story was that George S. Scott was next in line, star of Patton, and that would have been unusual casting, certainly. But he passed on the role, and so a call went in to Lloyd Bridges, and he signed up. Of course, Abrahams had worked with Lloyd Bridges on Airplane. The other lead role in the film, Ramada Thompson, was taken on by Valeria Golino. She'd appeared in Rain Man at this point, but it wasn't particularly clear she was a comedy performer. Abrams, though, saw over 100 actors for the role of Ramada, and he would say that she was the one who made us laugh, and as a consequence, she got the role. Filming then was ready to begin in January 1991, and this was a film that was costing $26 million to make, so it wasn't that cheap really, but there was commercial potential to it. There are an assortment of stories from the shooting of the film as well. And there's a sequence in the midst of it where Valeria Golino is being in the love scene with Charlie Sheen, pops an olive from her navel, for instance, into her mouth. And chums, I've got to tell you, according to an interview in the New York Times, she did that in 2 takes, and that is the level of research you get with this podcast. She did that in as many takes as Sigourney Weaver throwing the basketball into the hoop in Alien Resurrection. Unlike Top Gun, then, which had been seen pretty much as a recruitment video for the armed forces by the time it came out, and got cooperation from the American military fairly easily, with Hot Shots, the Navy was less interested in cooperating, and as a consequence, the Jim Abrams and his team, well, they had to make their own ships for the aircraft carrier sequences, and they had to be quite innovative, really, when it came to shooting the aircraft carrier moments in the movie. So there's a sequence, for instance, on an aircraft carrier, nominally at sea, and we see it from the flight deck, but this wasn't at sea at all, and instead what they did is they went to the cliff edge parking lot of a former marine park, not on a warm day. Remember, this was shot January to March, so hardly the weather to get your shorts out. Well, there's always someone on a film set that seems to have shorts. And this sequence on the aircraft carrier also needed a horse because, well, it needed a horse. So what they did is they built a wooden deck on this parking lot, on this cliff edge, and they had to film it at a particular angle to make it look like it was at sea. What they then did was they supplanted the footage with material from another 1991 release, Flight of the Intruder, to get some of the flying sequences and just some of the sea shots that they needed. They also, as it happened, borrowed footage from Rocky 2, if you want to go ultra nerdy. There's a boxing match sequence in there, and the crowd shots there are taken from the second Rocky movie. There was in the midst, I mean, it's always said to be quite serious business making a comedy, but in the case of Hot Shots, it became ever more serious when it became clear that real life conflict in the Gulf area, well, that was becoming more and more likely. And in fact, even though at the point where the script was written for the film, it was months before Saddam Hussein at that point invaded Kuwait, sent Iraqi forces into Kuwait. But as the film got closer and closer to production, it became clear that they were dealing with something that wasn't a million miles away from what was happening on the front page of the newspapers. And as filming began, those similarities they were raising some questions. After all, the plot of Hot Shots involves sending these fighter planes out to bomb a Middle Eastern nuclear weapons plant. Although, as it turns out, that isn't what they ultimately end up bombing, and the targets in fact are an accordion factory and a school for mimes. And so you couldn't say it was necessarily that similar to military operations, but nonetheless there were questions at that point about would people want to go and see a military comedy when American forces were at war, effectively. And Charlie Sheen would tell Entertainment Weekly, quote, it's a weird feeling coming to work wearing a piece of wardrobe that you're seeing on the front page of the Los Angeles Times every day. The unease would continue, and questions would continue to be asked right the way through the production. Abrams, though, well, he pressed ahead. He had to make his film and wanted to make his film, and that one of the issues he was facing was actually opening the movie up. And there was a point where on that very, very windy flight deck where a kissing scene between Sheen and Galino was, I think they had 14 takes to shoot it, and then ultimately in post-production, Abrams decided he was going to change tack with the movie. He was going to change he's going to put in a different prologue, which would ultimately render that kissing scene later in the movie moot, wouldn't be able to be used. And he came up with this prologue when he went to test, the film was in post-production at this point, and he went to test the trailer. He wanted to go and see it with an audience, and so what they did is they tested the first trailer for Hot Shots in front of a public screening of Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves. I've covered that on a previous podcast. And so Abrams watched how the trailer played, and then he hung around to watch the film. And had he not sat and watched Dances with Wolves after testing that trailer, as the story would go, then he wouldn't have gone away and worked with Pat Proft on writing the new prologue to Hot Shots that was filmed after principal photography was done, involving Charlie Sheen as Fluffy Bunny Feet and riffing heavily on Dances with Wolves. It's worth noting as well that when it came to the sequences with Lloyd Bridges in the scene, there's one moment in the movie where Bridges really wasn't well. And going back to Robert Emery's book, Abraham said, one day we were filming the first Hot Shots and Lloyd Bridges was filming a big scene and we could tell he was not up to snuff, and it took him a little longer than normal to get through the scene. And he continued the story. He said, quote, he left the set that day and was in hospital for 3 weeks with pneumonia, but he would never let on how sick he was. I would show you his performance of that day and you'd never have a clue how sick he was, but that's the kind of man he was. Filming then wrapped up, and the post-production period on Hot Shots was not particularly long. If the first batch of filming was done in March, the plan was to get the movie into cinemas for July of 1991. However, there was a threat to the film at the box office on the horizon, and that was David Zucker, Leslie Nielsen, and the Naked Gun 2.5, The Smell of Fear, and that was due around the same time. In fact, if you look at the release dates, the Naked Gun sequel came out on June the 28th, 1991 in the US. Hot Shots would follow 1 month and 3 days later. We wouldn't get Hot Shots till the end of the year in the UK. That it opened a multiplex in Birmingham. I think it was in November of that year. But there was some worry about whether these two films, you wait for a spoof to come along and what do you know, here come two. There was some worry about whether one would knock the other one out. as it would happen, no fear on that part. And in fact, if anything, Hot Shots was the better received of the two movies. That Naked Gun 2 would make its money. But on its release in the US, Hot Shots was the film that finally knocked Terminator 2 Judgment Day off the top of the American box office. That it opened the weekend, it appeared in the weekend chart August the 2nd to the 4th, 1991 in the States. It topped the box office with $10 million. That was a lot of money then. Terminator 2 was second. Doc Hollywood was third. Problem Child 2, that was in fourth. Boys in the Hood in fifth, just to give you a kind of idea of what it was up against. And in fact, Hot Shots would go on to be quite a handsome hit. It would do 70 million's worth of business in the US, 111 million of business overseas. So this $23 million comedy, $26 million comedy would return 181 million to Fox's coffers, appreciating everyone has to take their slice of that. And it was clear it was going to be successful enough to warrant a sequel. It's worth noting, I love this, that of all the films that could have been chosen for the Royal Film Performance that takes place every year in the UK in front of the Queen, Hot Shots was the one that was picked. So how the Queen found a sequence spoofing the love scenes of one or two movies, I got no idea. I wasn't in the room between you and me. Fox then wanted a sequel. Abrams had a hit, and as Abrams would say, the reason the sequel came about was primarily just because the film had been successful at that point. In fact, I covered Hot Shots Part 2, as the film would be called, and I think the sequel is superior to this one. I like Hot Shots. I think the second one's better, but I covered that in a previous episode of Film Stories. In terms of the career of Jim Abrams, though, his life would undergo changes that would gradually see him stepping back from film directing. This started to hold in 1993, so around the time that the second Hot Shots movie was released. That Abrams' son was then just under a year old, and he had very, very, very hard to control epilepsy, and as I'm quoting this off the Charlie Foundation, which Abrams has set up. They quote, as a last resort, while Charlie was experiencing multiple daily seizures and multiple daily medications, his parents turned to a ketogenic diet for help. They were successful with that, and as a consequence, Abrams looked to cover that in his work as well. He would go on to make a television film called First Do No Harm, but would gradually move more of his efforts into the foundation and spreading the word of something that had been hugely helpful to he and his son. And thus his final film as director wouldn't be too far down the line. It would be 1998's Jane Austen's Mafia, which that came with something like 35 million budget, and that would be the last time he stepped behind the camera to direct. It would star Lloyd Bridges, and whilst Abrahams has since reunited with the Zuckers on at least one of the Zuckers on Scary Movie sequel, he's kind of stepped back. Occasionally there's been bits of talk about a possible Hot Shots 3, but there seems precious little sign that's going to happen, not least because Charlie Sheen's own career and own life has taken some well-charted turns that have been heavily reported in the tabloid press, and quite whether the Planet wants him as the lead in another Hot Shots film now, I don't quite know. What I do know is that Hot Shots was, really, it was the last but one time that someone was able to launch a spoof franchise. It wouldn't happen again until Scary Movie came along. But in the case of Hot Shots, the two movies, I think they're still popular. I think that on the whole they still stand up. They're obviously, the political bits in the midst of them don't always look necessarily massively comfortable, but conversely to the fears that the filmmakers and Fox had during the production of the movie, it didn't seem to make an awful lot of difference when it came to the box office. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. Just a couple of very quick favours. Number one is, if you like this podcast, please, if you could subscribe to it, if you could go and leave, ideally, a hugely positive review at your podcast home of choice. I'm an independent podcast producer. I don't have a big company behind me. So anything you can do to just help spread the word, that's what's got me this far, and I can't thank you enough for it. To be honest, I can't thank you enough for listening listening anyway. So anything on top of that is a real bonus for me. The latest issue of Film Stories magazine is available now, actually, at the time this podcast is released. You can find out more about that at filmstories.co.uk. And I'm also keeping open my offer for anyone out there who's got an independent film podcast or independent podcast, independent filmmakers, particularly UK centric really, who are struggling to get word out. I will put free 20-second adverts in the middle of this podcast. If you want to get in touch with me, probably best to do it over Twitter. You'll find me there at Simon Brew. My direct messages are open, and so if you drop me a note there, we'll take it. We'll pick it up from there. But now I'm going to crack on with the second of the two films I'm going to talk about. I really, as regular podcast listeners may know, I really, really love the work of Kevin Costner. I think he's made some terrific film choices. I'm going to move now to what, in my view, is one of his top 5 films. I'm going to the year 2000. Let me play you a clip. I'll pick up the story the other side of this.
Morning, gentlemen.
Morning, Mr. President.
What is it?
On Sunday morning, one of our U-2s took these pictures. The Soviets are putting medium-range ballistic missiles into Cuba.
Oh, my God.
Our cities and military installations in the southeast, as far north as Washington, D.C., are in range of these weapons, and in the event of a launch, we'll have only 5 minutes warning.
So that's nice and cheery then. This is the year 2000's 13 Days, directed by Roger Donaldson, screenplay by David Self, using a book by Ernest R. May and Philip D. Zellico as a source. Kevin Costner takes the lead in this one, Bruce Greenwood in the ensemble as well, Dylan Baker, and just a really smart ensemble of generally not hugely known faces, but it's a very big cast and with a lot of very good performances in it. And this one tells the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, where American President John F. Kennedy was in the White House at that point. This would see Costner going back to the era of Kennedy, as he'd done with JFK. I've covered that on a previous podcast. But in the 1990s, recordings of conversations around the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment in history that nearly took the planet to basically World War III. But the conversations around that time were released. And so Ernest May and Philip Zellico, well, they're a pair of authors who'd studied the Cuban Missile Crisis. They're aware that the transcripts of tapes from the White House at that point had become available, that they needed to be handled carefully. And so they captured them in their book, The Kennedy Tapes. It was around the middle of the 90s when this came to the attention of Hollywood. And it was Beacon Pictures, headed up by Armyan Bernstein, that was particularly interested in it. Quite who asked who. I've seen conflicting stories on this, that Kevin Costner was said to be interested and asked Bernstein if he was interested in getting involved, and I've seen it the other way round as well, that it was Bernstein that asked Costner. Nonetheless, those two were clearly the catalyst for this film going forward. Beacon wanted in, and as a consequence, they needed a screenwriter. So David Self told the Los Angeles Times that it was Bernstein who approached him, initially with the idea of doing a love story set against the background of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Self wasn't particularly keen on this. The idea of a love story angle wasn't really appealing, but the idea of doing a historical drama telling the story of the missile crisis itself, well, that he was far more interested in. And as Self said, I persuaded Army, that's Armyan Bernstein, that this story should be told from an everyman's point of view with a character that would get us into the White House. And so they identified that character as Kenny O'Donnell, who worked alongside John F. Kennedy during Kennedy's presidency. So Self began writing the script in the spring of 1997, and he called on CIA documents and tapes as well as the source book as well. And while he was working on that, Beacon got to work in trying to basically put the film together. It had Kevin Costner, then still a movie star with some clout, as part and parcel of the project, so people were going to be interested in it, but still it was going to be quite a tough sell because this was going to be a dense historical drama if they weren't careful. So First of all, the plan was to take the film to Universal, because that's where Beacon had its development deal. And with that in mind, the search was then on just to find a director who could come in and just help develop it and bring it to the point where it was ready for production. First director through the door was Lawrence Kasdan. Now, I don't think it's a huge coincidence, given that Costner had had toing and froing on projects with directors throughout the 1990s, that the directors who primarily were sounded out for this film were people who'd worked with Costner before and had survived to tell the tale, basically. So Kasdan had given Costner his break, even though he left it on the cutting room floor, with a small part in his film The Big Chill. Also directed him in Silverado. He wrote The Bodyguard and directed Costner in Wyatt Earp as well, and he was interested in making the film that would become 13 Days. But in the end, by the time David Self had finished writing his screenplay and delivered his screenplay, which was in December of 1997, Kasdan was committed to making a project of his own that he'd written and would direct, a film called Mumford, which skipped a cinema release in the end in the UK. It was a commercial disappointment, but it is a good film. It's worth seeking out. With the final draft of the script as it stood in his hand, though, Army Bernstein then sounded out John Frankenheimer, who'd been doing Ronin around this time. That was set to be released the year after, but Frankenheimer, for whatever reason, that didn't work out. Then Edward Zwick, who directed the likes of Glory, would go on to The Last Samurai. He was suggested, but then Universal suggested Phil Alden Robinson. Now, Phil Alden Robinson had directed Costner in arguably his best film, Field of Dreams, and was keen to work with Costner again. And so he joined the project while it was set up at Universal, but he would ultimately leave the film due to creative differences. And those creative differences were his vision of the film was it was going to be much more Kennedy driven rather than the script that had been put together, which saw the crisis more through the eyes of a side character, Kenny O'Donnell. The Kennedy angle didn't appeal to Bernstein and didn't appeal to Costner, and as a consequence, Phil Alden Robinson departed the project. Now, at this point, Universal as well was getting cold feet about the film, that its commercial prospects it was no box office home run on paper, and so it put the project into turnaround. And so Beacon was able to set it up somewhere else, took the film to Sony, where it had just collaborated on the Harrison Ford headline Air Force One, which itself was a project that was originally set to star Kevin Costner, but Costner passed on it and gave the script to Harrison Ford, as again I've told in a previous Film Stories episode. So when it was at Sony, Sony then looked around at directors that it had worked with and had some success with, and guess what? Here's a film I covered on a previous podcast as well. The Mask of Zorro had just proven to be a success, and Martin Campbell had directed that. Campbell would go on to do he'd done GoldenEye before, would go on to do Casino Royale, but The Mask of Zorro, after a long time in gestation, well, that had proven to be both a critical and commercial hit. And so Campbell then got interested in making the film, and conversations began, but he too would depart the movie. There would be disagreements on this one over the casting. And so as another director, we're already up to, 3 directors really who've departed this one. As another director left, Sony decided that this one might not be for them, that it was going to struggle to skew to a younger audience. And also, Michael Mann's film, The Insider, would struggle in 1999 as well. And that was also a consideration for studios. That was there really a market for big, serious dramas like this? So, when Sony dropped out, well, New Line Cinema came in, and New Line had been interested in the film before, but Army Bernstein rang New Line up, and they pretty much snapped his arm off. They were really keen to take the film on. New Line then inked a deal where it would stump up around half the 80 million budget. Beacon would be expected to find the rest, and then the idea would be that they would split distribution in the film, that New Line would distribute it in the US, that Beacon would have the rights overseas, which it would sell on to various third parties. But this film finally looked like it was going ahead. But the director's chair was still empty, so the hunt went on. The Los Angeles Times did a big piece on this, and just reading through, it's a bit of a who's who of directors who came close to doing this. Spielberg was sounded out at one point, as it turned out, but he got more interested in the writer David Self, and he would take him to his DreamWorks company, where he would work on The Haunting, where he would work on Road to Perdition, and he would also go on to do The Wolfman for Universal. But so Spielberg wasn't going to take this one on, but someone who got a little bit closer was Francis Ford Coppola. Now, Coppola at this stage of his career was seen as a bit more of a director for hire. He directed a John Grisham adaptation, The Rainmaker, directed the Robin Williams comedy Jack, and so he was interested to the point where he invited Costner and Bernstein to his home, and they had a look around and a chat about the project. But what was said to have dampened Coppola's interest in the movie was the death of Stanley Kubrick, the sudden death of Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick died shortly after completing the movie Eyes Wide Shut, and at that point Coppola was said to have had second thoughts about did he really at this stage in his life want to take on someone else's script and make that. There was also the factor that Coppola was unlikely to be cheap. Costner already was due to have a deal that would give him 15% of the gross, and Coppola would also be looking to take a cut in all likelihood, and all of a sudden there wasn't that much of the pie to cut up anymore, and so it just wasn't to be. Costner himself was also believed to have considered directing. This seemed quite logical. He'd directed Dances with Wolves. He'd had less luck directing The Postman. He would go on to do Open Range, which I'll come to in a future film stories. But as he would tell the Los Angeles Times, the movie is going to come under so much scrutiny that it would have put too much onus on the film if I directed it. And he would say, actually, even with the script, I've even taken lines away from Kenny, the character he would play, and given them to Jack and Bobby Kennedy, who he wouldn't play, because they couldn't come out of my mouth. And he said the media would have looked at everything because, oh yeah, Kevin Costner's changed the story so that it's Kenny O'Donnell saving the world, and he was conscious of that, and ultimately he didn't want to direct it. In the end, it was another former Costner collaborator who got the call, and this was Roger Donaldson, who directed Costner in the terrific thriller No Way Out. If you're looking for a thriller to go in knowing nothing about, that is a great one to start with. And so Donaldson was interested, and he duly signed up, and as a consequence, this film was now finally going ahead. It had taken a lot of directors to get to this stage, but finally the green light was given. Now, filming on this one was earmarked for the 4th of October 1999, run through to January 2000. But there was, there were little casting bits and bobs, but also there was just the size of the production, that this filmed on an enormous set. That the film is mainly contained within the White House and its grounds, and it's lots of conversations of people in a room and trying to find the drama in that. And the job of recreating the White House was put onto production designer Dennis Washington. And what he did is he took a warehouse and he built a White House in a warehouse. And I mean, it's on the DVD if you dig it out, where they show you just the size of the set, but also they didn't just build the interior of it, they built the exterior of the White House on the same set as well. So it wasn't on a separate stage, it was all part and parcel of this huge construction. Set decoration from Denise Pizzini is also notable, because as Roger Donaldson says on the director's commentary, there's loads of little details in the White House set that the camera just wouldn't pick up, but they were just really keen that they got the details right. Now, Costner had looked at the idea of playing John F. Kennedy in the film, but he saw, as he admitted to Entertainment Weekly, that there were, quote, too many minefields in him doing so, and he ultimately decided to take on the role of O'Donnell. But he said, I mean, Kennedy's such an icon that you needed someone, I'm trying to think of the words here, someone with less flesh impact, someone that isn't as well known as I am, because otherwise the question becomes, how well is Costner doing as Kennedy? As it would happen, the question would come up anyway as to how well is Costner doing a Boston accent as Kenny O'Donnell, but nonetheless, as Costner said, it would become all about everything that I was doing wrong. You would never get in to Kennedy. And thus, that's why the character of Kenny O'Donnell was beefed up. And Costner addressed this in promotion for the movie around the time of its release. And he said, well, the Kennedys are getting their due. They're the ones who are really golden in this story. And he admitted that they went and sought out Kenny O'Donnell's son, Kevin, to find out which bits of the script he was comfortable with and uncomfortable with. And he worked with them and he told them that there were parts of the script that were going a bit too far. But also they had to balance that against the fact that they needed drama for this to work. So they did take a couple of liberties with the character of Kenny, but not too many. They were keen that this was authentic, and they always had those CIA documents and those tapes to fall back on as well. The key, if there's a key piece of casting, then it is the casting of John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert, and it was Bruce Greenwood and Stephen Culp who got those respective roles, but they had to put in a lot of work to get the accents and to get the interaction between the two of them right. And as the story goes, they would be calling each other on the phone to practice their Boston accents in the weeks leading up to filming beginning, that they were basically drilling each other on the accents until it became second nature to talk to each other in the manner in which the film required them to do. The need for all of this to be on one stage was identified in pre-production, and it meant that they could, and it sounds very West Wingy this, as in the TV show, but it meant that they could roam. And Donaldson talks about this on the disc, about he wanted the film to be able to go out of those stuffy rooms, and so the camera could follow them as they stepped outside for a chat before they stepped back inside, and to be able to do that continuously. It is a meeting-driven film for large parts, and they needed the movement within the film because otherwise it's just still shots of people in rooms. In fact, he shot meeting scenes with multiple characters with multiple setups. He had multiple cameras in the room as if he was shooting an action sequence, just so he would have options in the edit that he'd be able to get reactions, he'd be able to get specific close-ups, get more of a bit of a feel of claustrophobia and tension building up. So they had this enormous set, and they would be able to walk out into the garden of the White House and then walk back in. Such was the size of it. I think the only set around the time that was of equal size would have been The Terminal, the Spielberg film, which followed a few years later. But such was the level of construction involved in this one. Not everything was shot on that set. I mean, there are sequences in Cuba in the movie, but actually they went and shot those in the Philippines. What the film was also able to do was skillfully use archive footage in various places as well. That there is digital work in this one, but it takes a very Forrest Gump approach in that it makes a lot of the digital work implicit. The film opens with footage of huge explosions, and this was actually footage that had official footage of real explosions that had been released that they were able to use in the movie. There is a sequence in the movie too where there are shots of a protest taking place outside the White House. They actually got permission to shoot establishing shots of the White House for those sequences, and then what they got is they picked up archive footage of real protests from decades earlier, and they were able to blend the two of them into the one shot. And Donaldson argues on the disc extras that you would struggle really to see that, and I think he's right. So they took official military footage that had been declassified and to use that to build the sense of threat right at the start of the movie, and then they used an assortment of trickeries, perhaps not as overtly as Oliver Stone did with JFK, but an assortment of trickery just to get over the scale of what they were up against, but also the sense of history of it all as well. I mean, take the plane flights that happen within the movie. I mean, it was important to them that they were authentic. I'm going to spoil a light on this in case you don't know it, because this is a wonderful film to discover if you've never seen it. There's a moment where some aerial footage is required, and they did that for real. And what they did is they happened upon a bunch of planes that weren't being flown anymore that they were able to repaint and borrow for the production and then return intact. But it was quite hairy having to do the low level flying in order to get those shots, but they did indeed get those shots. Now, Donaldson, I had the chance to talk to Roger Donaldson about 13 Days a couple of years ago, and he did tell me that he loved doing stuff like this. In fact, he said, I'll never have as much fun making a movie as I did on those big ones. Dante's Peak and 13 Days, the two he cited, he said they were really films that aren't going to get made that same way anymore. As it turned out, I think he's pretty much on the mark there. 13 Days was thus completed and was in the can for March of 2000, and the release of it was set for December 2000. There were still a couple of challenges in post-production, and in particular, Costner had a run-in on his film for Love of the Game, directed by Sam Raimi, where he'd done battle with the ratings board in America over the R rating that the film got, and in fact Universal cut it back to a PG-13, and Costner was not happy with that at all. And he was almost coming up against the same thing again with 13 Days, that because the movie had cost 80 million to make, and this wasn't a big huge action film or anything like that, they needed a PG-13 rating in the US to give it a chance of just getting its money back. And so, for instance, and Costner talked to Entertainment Weekly and the Los Angeles Times about this, there's a line of profanity in the movie that was cut in order not to risk getting a harder rating. And as Costner tells the story, the character of O'Donnell is on the phone when Kennedy walks in, and he's yelling into the phone, there's a word you need to learn in politics, it's loyalty. Loyalty, mother fencer. You can kind of work that out. And Costner said it was such a cool line, it was exactly the right tone we needed, but that line isn't in the movie anymore. All you hear now is loyalty, loyalty, and it sounds kind of stupid, doesn't have the same resonance. It's like we're practically making the airplane version the TV version. And Costner would say he's the dinosaur on this issue, that he believed in doing things the old-fashioned way. And he was asked whether he could have insisted that the profanity stayed in, and he just said, yeah, but I would have to say it was going to be in there or I won't promote the film. That's the kind of stance I would have had to take, and frankly I'm a little tired of doing that. I don't like to threaten. So it's still a few wounds, I'd suggest, from the fallout over For Love of the Game the year before. Now, when it came to the release of the movie, this one needed an Oscar run to get it to work, and thus, as a consequence, it was given a limited release in the US. It premiered on the 19th of December 2000, and then got a release in Los Angeles and New York to qualify for the Oscars on Christmas Day 2000, before a wide release in January 2001. There was a sense in that New Line had lost a little bit of confidence in the project. I talked to Roger Donaldson about this because at the time New Line was building up to, at the point it greenlit 13 Days, it was also building up to its biggest ever financial gamble, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Now, when I covered the Hunger Games before, when Lionsgate made the first Hunger Games film, it raided the budgets of pretty much every other movie it had in production to be able to afford the Hunger Games. It bet the house on it. That wasn't the case with New Line. The budget of 13 Days stayed in place, even though the New Line's resources were being poured into Lord of the Rings. But as Donaldson said, it did have a consequence when it came to the release of the film. So even though Lord of the Rings wasn't coming out until the year after, the build-up was already being planned to its Cannes Film Festival footage promotion, which would follow 5-6 months after the release of 13 Days. And Donaldson said they were definitely focused on Lord of the Rings and not 13 Days, both financially and how they went about releasing. And the release was the film on its release, it got good reviews. It didn't get the great reviews it needed to really launch it into the awards season, and as a consequence it picked up no interest at all from awards season either. I mean, it just pretty much came and went. That the film wasn't a box office disappointment, an extreme box office disappointment, but against the $80 million budget, it grossed $66 million worldwide, and clearly that wasn't the kind of return they were looking for. It opened wide on the Martin Luther King Jr. weekend in America at the start of January, and it opened in 6th place with $11 million across that long weekend. Topping the box office that weekend actually was a surprise hit, Save the Last Dance, which I think is a really good film actually. Julia Stiles headlines that one, but that was a surprise hit, $27 million that took. But with takings below expectations and no awards, New Line really had a decision as what to do next at this point. Now, New Line at this stage was making some of the best DVDs on the market. I think it was its Platinum Edition range, really put a shift in terms of extra features and releases such as Boogie Nights and Magnolia and the Osteopath. I mean, all sorts of terrific discs that it put out. And so what it decided to do was launch a new DVD label, and launched it with 13 Days, called Infinifilm, which was a little bit of a mouthful, but the idea was this really took you into the film and got into the meat behind the movie as well. And I've drawn on that disc a lot for this podcast, and I have to say the extra features on the 13 Days disc are just terrific. They really plant the film in an historical context, and there's an awful lot of supplementary stuff in there. But New Line picked 13 Days as the springboard for this new line of discs. Now, the DVD market would dissipate over the subsequent years, but it's interesting that there's a real standout that this film's disc release was not one that the company behind it gave up on at all. Over time, the reputation of 13 Days, I think, has grown. I think there's a lot more appreciation for it now as more and more people discover it. I also think it's one of the last highly budgeted adult dramas, not in that way, which is basically taking a slice of history and putting a lot of people into a room and getting them to work it all out. And the fact that it sustains nearly 2.5 hours in pretty much edge of the seat style is a real testament to all involved. I'd love Costner and Donaldson to work together again. As it turns out, the two films that they've made together amongst two of the finest in both of their respective careers. Which all brings me to the end of the latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you as always for listening. You can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project, which covers podcast, website, magazine, at Film Stories Pod. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. You can find a whole range of exclusive video film stories on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Film Stories. And then at our website, filmstories.co.uk, daily, every weekday, loads of movie news, loads of features, trying to do things a bit different there, trying to do it without the clickbait as well. If you would like to support the work that we do on that website and also support this podcast, I'm on Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew. Thank you to everyone supporting me there. But most of all, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your ears. I hope I've not bored you too much. I'm going to be back in another week with another bunch of film stories. For now, the most important thing as always is you all stay safe, you all take care, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.